Excellent. So welcome to this year's Concerned Philosophers for Peace virtual conference. I don't want to take away any of John's time. I'm going to try to hold both speakers to 35 minutes. So I will cut you all off at that point, but otherwise I'll give John the floor and we'll just help out with Q&A. So to begin, I hope I get John's name right, John Patrick Pineda. Excellent. Is going to be presenting contested spaces and the meta-narrative of neoliberalism. So please give your attention to John.
So, good morning, everyone, and it's evening actually here from the Philippines. Let me just share my screen. All right. Uh, there you go. Okay. So again, good morning to everyone, and good evening here from the Philippines. It's actually 10:01 here, and I'll be presenting my paper. It's entitled "Contested Spaces and the Meta-Narrative of Neoliberalism," and it's about the competing notions of development, legality, and progress in the city of Manila. So this research is actually based on one of my advisors when I was in my undergraduate, and I chose to dwell on some of the notions of his paper because he was taking his PhD in political science at the time, and do my own analysis of it using Iris Marignan's philosophy. Okay, for our discussion today, I'll be focusing on three key points. First is order, progress, and legality. So we'll look at the contrasting views and the understanding of what legal means for the two groups, namely sidewalk vendors and government officials. And then we'll also have a special focus on the grassroots interpretation of legality because this is one of the contested concepts, and how order and progress is seen as a neoliberal meta-narrative in terms of the relationship between sidewalk vendors and the city of Manila. The second point I'll be talking about is the difference between legality and oppression, because these opposing interpretations of legality engender and sustain both old and new forms of oppression, not just for sidewalk vendors, but to society as a whole. And then the third point I'll be talking about will be how culture can be the best mediating factor in solving the tension between conflict and the understanding of legality. Okay. So let's go let's go with the first part. When we ask the question, what is legal in terms of between the national government, the local government, and the sidewalk vendors in the city of Manila, we often have these answers. For the national government here in the Philippines, in terms of sidewalk vending, in Umali v. Aquino, which is a case decided by the Supreme Court, the occupation and use by private individuals of sidewalks and other public places devoted to public use constitute both public nuisances and nuisances per se. On the part of the city of Manila, there had been 10 issuances, such as ordinances and executive orders, from 1973 up to 2015, regulating sidewalk vending, public markets, and organizing informal vendors in the city of Manila. But of course, the problem here is that when you look at the sites of sidewalk vending, specifically the district of Quiapo, this this district of Quiapo, has been a site of commercial activity even before colonization. The Philippines, for context, was colonized by the Spanish in 1565. The Chinese, the Indians, and the Arabs who have been trading with Filipinos before the arrival of the Spanish have been trading there since time immemorial. So when you look at the history of the area, even before the establishment of the Philippines, or the Philippines as a concept per se, that has been a commercial area now. And until now, it's a commercial area. So this is one of the streets of Quiapo when you look at it in the photo. And when you ask sidewalk vendors, what is legal for you? Or what's legality for you? They often answer that they are not snatchers, they are not petty thieves, And they do that because they want to sustain their families. And that's legal work for them because they don't kill anyone, they don't steal. And funnily, they often say that they are not like policemen or barangay officials. Barangay is the lowest level of the local government here in the Philippines who live off bribes. So, given that given that perspective, there's already a different view of legality here because they see themselves as legitimate businesses. When you compare it to the notion of, like, let's say, the perspective of the national government and the local government, their very existence is illegal because the streets are owned by the people. But the question is, who are the people? Who are we talking about here? And so, from one of the research done also on the city of Manila, namely Agnes and Martin, Agnes is actually my professor in undergraduate. They identified the following as the goals of the Manila local government issuances, which are primarily hallmarks of neoliberal urbanism. Namely, there's revenue collection and economic growth. It tends to commercialize everything because of neoliberal ideas. The second is that flea markets as an imperative business. Like, people tend to go to flea markets because it's cheaper, the produce are fresher, for example, and therefore it's an imperative business. It means that it's a necessary aspect of the economic activity of any locality, more so in Manila, which is the capital of the country. Third is that one of the goals also of the local government issuances is that it aims to develop a tourist attraction and the beautification of the area. However, the problem here is that when you develop something as a tourist attraction or beautification, there are different notions of what beauty is, for example. And they tend to use the example of other countries, primarily European countries which have a strong street market culture. For example, Paris, Rome, for example. And this is very distant from what Filipino culture is, for example. And then for numbers 4 to 6, it's of course the economic and the regulation aspect of the local government, such as the protection of legitimate business, the promotion of just competition, and the responsiveness to the demands of time and the economy. So let's now look at the second part of my paper, which talks about legality and oppression. Because there comes the question wherein, what if the law itself is oppressive? What if it hinders economic activity, for example? So how does it become oppressive? And here I applied the framework of Iris Marion Young, which is namely the 5 phases of oppression. Oh, I haven't placed the text here, but my apologies for that. For exploitation, the best example here is that um, the vendors, or namely the urban poor in the city of Manila, is exploited usually by local government officials and even by the national government, especially during the time of elections. In a few months, the Philippines will be electing a set of new leaders, from the president down to mayors. And there will be another round of promises aimed at the urban poor, aimed at sidewalk vendors, especially in the city of Manila. Ironically, the incumbent mayor of Manila is running for president, and he hasn't solved this quote unquote problem of sidewalk vending. So we might see another round of promises regarding this one, beautification of streets, and all those things. In marginalization, Iris Marion Young talks here about how certain social groups are marginalized from the decision making process. And this also applies to sidewalk vendors. How? Whenever there is a policy on vending and street management, sidewalk vendors tend to be excluded from these consultation mechanisms. They tend to invite one or two vendors, but these vendors would also say na we don't know these people. They don't represent us. That's why the decisions that you are making are not responsive to our needs, for example. And then there's powerlessness. This is related to marginalization because there's the lack of participation in formal and informal consultation methods on public markets management. For example, the city of Manila had this project of renovating a very old market dating from the Spanish colonial era. But when they expelled the vendors, for example, there was no consultation. When they offered these vendors who were displaced new places for them to do their trade, there was also no consultation on how much the rent would be, what are the provisions of the contract, for example, and all those things. And then the fourth phase of oppression, according to Young, is cultural imperialism. This is now very apparent in the neoliberal urban planning schemes modeled after Western practices because there tends there tends to be a model that's not based on what is responsive to Philippine culture, for example. It's mostly based on European models. But when you compare it to the economic development of the Philippines as to the economic model of European countries, these are disparate because European countries are well developed. The Philippines is still a developing country, so this doesn't apply. And the insistence on using these models is a form of cultural imperialism on the part of sidewalk vendors. And then violence. Sidewalk vendors are often subjected to harassment and violent dispersal by police and city officials. I remember this one story when I was around 8 or 9 years old. We were in a flea market with my parents, and suddenly there was this rush of people going to in the opposite direction. Turns out there was a raid of sidewalk vendors. And what did I see at the time? The police were beating these vendors. Some of their wares, for example, were being doused with gasoline and set on fire. So that's the form of naked violence that they're subjected to. And these raids usually happen um, without any warning. I also tried to identify a sixth phase of oppression. And I think that the constant problem in Philippine society, as well as in other developing countries, for example, is the presence of corruption at every strata of the bureaucracy. According to Stoffer here, it enforces pseudo collaboration, convincing people that participation in the corrupt system is the only way to personally survive and to preserve societal order. When you see this, as you look at this photo, it bears the logo of the city of Manila. It bears the signature of the city treasurer. It has the letterhead of the city treasurer. But take note, this is not an official document. But sidewalk vendors are given this document. They pay 20 pesos every day for this one. Someone collects it. There is no official receipt. So this is one of the how corruption is somehow institutionalized in some of the practices. And given the fact that they have limited resources because they tend to trade at a certain time, and of course, not all the time they have customers, of course. Whatever is taken from them in the form of goods or money, either by policemen, local officials, is a form of economic oppression to them. Whether it's a bribe to avoid arrest or to be granted permission to set up their stall, or unofficial tickets or damages for the use of public property, such as this one. The problematic thing here is that there is this ordinance, but when you look at the ordinance, it doesn't have this provision for the damages part. And this doesn't have a receipt, for example. So how do you hold these funds accountable? How are these funds spent? Are these spent for developing the area? I don't think so. And then let's look at the last part, which is development and neoliberalism. This is the last part of my paper. So when we talk about development, and I also ask this question among vendors and the local government, for the vendors, since vending is not a criminal activity, they should be allowed to continue trading in the streets. And if the local authorities insist on their disappearance from the streets, it is therefore the duty of the local government to provide a feasible alternative in the form of secure jobs and livelihood. But um, administrations have come and gone. This hasn't happened. Okay? This has not happened. Whenever they're given a livelihood program, for example, it's often not feasible. If they are asked to be relocated, the relocation site is usually disconnected from the power source. They are disconnected from the water source, for example. So they tend to go back to the city because it's not sustainable. On the other hand, when you ask the local government about their notion of development, they always answer that as part of the public domain, no vendor should occupy the sidewalk, and therefore it is illegal. The proliferation of sidewalk vendors makes the city dirty and unattractive, and it makes um, it becomes hard, therefore, to convince potential investors to pour much needed investments and capital into the city because there's an underground economy, and this is not somehow aligned with the values of the local government, for example. And again, apparent in their responses is the very notion of liberalism here. Because when we talk to the local government officials, they always say that, we're imitating Singapore as a model. We want to be a smart city like Singapore. But when you look at Singapore, hawker culture and sidewalk vending is deeply rooted in their culture. In fact, the government has been campaigning for its inclusion in the UNESCO list of intangible heritage. And there is an extended legal recognition and protection to the trade as cultural heritage. Compare it with the response of the city of Manila. It aims to create a smart city based on a neoliberal and a legal business model approach, in which the bureaucracy treats its own citizens not as partners nor stakeholders, but as problems that need to be solved through a legalistic business approach. They are problems, therefore we have to solve them. This is the law, we have to apply it. Why not try talking to your constituents first? Or why not look at why that area has been a commercial area for so long? In fact, there are historical roots for it. And they do not recognize this heritage. They do not recognize this history. All they think is that it's ugly. Let's remove it, for example. So, given that response, for example, given that response, the legalistic business model is sorely lacking in terms of mechanisms in addressing the problem, if it is a problem. In fact, I am reminded of this one interview with the city official in which he says that if something is littering in the streets, you call it garbage. They are littering in the streets and therefore they are garbage. And where do you put the garbage? So it's similar to saying that these people who are working in the streets in order to give their families a decent life are equivalent to garbage. And I find the language objectionable, to be honest, because it's a form of what? Violence, I think. Because it erases the very notion of human dignity at all. So this is one of the many problems in terms of how the problem is addressed. So to conclude this presentation, I have 6 minutes remaining. The institutional and legal changes alone won't solve the problem if it is treated as a problem. Because there needs to be a certain attitude from both parties, namely, especially from the local government. So there should be openness to dialogue, for one, with other stakeholders. The desire for progress is universal. I mean, no one wants to get left behind. No one gets to, no one likes to get stuck in the cycle of poverty and powerlessness. It's imperative, therefore, that in our desire for progress, everyone participates because if someone is left behind, the progress that we make is meaningless. I saw this sign one evening while I was walking here around. It says, do not block sidewalks. Sidewalks are for people. If sidewalks are for the people, we ask the question, therefore, who are the people? Are this big business? Or the people who are voting, who are paying taxes, who drive the economy around? So I would like to end this presentation here. So I'll be answering your questions. Thank you so much.
All right. I don't see any questions in Q&A. Sorry, in the chat box. If you would like to chat, if you would like to enter a question into chat, I can read it off. However, if you would like to ask a question, I believe you can use the raise hand feature, and I will try to call on you, or John can call on you as well. Either way works.
Hey, John, this is Court. I have a question. I love the final question, right? I think that's the heart of it. Has anybody asked the government or government officials this question? I mean, do you know if they've tried to address it in any way?
Well, ironically, the incumbent mayor of Manila claims to be one of these people because he comes from the masses. If you look at his story, he comes from the slums of Tondo, which is the largest slum in Manila, and he claims to be one of the people. But ironically, when he became mayor in 2019, the first order of business was to clean the streets of Manila. And therefore, in cleaning the streets of Manila, it's displacing the same people he claims to represent. Because what he says is that um, people won't invest in his city, therefore, we need to clean the city, for example. And whenever this question is asked, it's always, especially in elections, when you ask them, who are the people anyway? Right? It's often like they will claim they are one with the people, but the policies that they are presenting are not people friendly. For example, in terms of labor, contractual labor is still not outlawed here in the Philippines. For example, I think we are famous in international news because of our president and his policies, right? So um, there's often this no the notion of being the people is always contested because I think one lacking in the political culture here in the Philippines is that we are very parochial. Like we are vocal in local issues. We are rarely vocal on national issues unless it affects us, for example. But the next election would be interesting because it's somehow um, there would be a no there would be a clash between the people on social media and then the people on the ground. And of course, campaigning would be different. I think it would be dependent on social media because of pandemic restrictions here. But that would be an interesting point as we enter the elections next year.
A question from Leonard.
Thanks. John, thanks very much for your talk. I've really enjoyed it. This is just really a request for clarification and elaboration about the sixth phase of oppression that you suggested there. That really got my interest. I wonder if you'd be willing to say a couple words more about this and whether you think it has more general applications than the one that you explored in the paper itself.
Okay. As to corruption as a phase of oppression, when you look at the notion of corruption in developing societies, especially here in the Philippines, it's not necessarily an exercise of power, but of course, there's an aspect of power behind it. But it's more of a question of resources. Like, for example, it's always policemen asking for bribes. It's always middlemen asking for special privileges in terms of trade, for example. It's always high government officials asking for a cut on official government projects, as high as 20% sometimes. So, how is it oppression? We do not lack natural resources. We do not lack funds, for example. But why is it that the same problems arise whenever a natural calamity happens, for example? Like the Philippines is one of the countries most prone to natural disasters. Name it. Earthquakes, we have it here. Volcanoes, we have it here. Typhoons, we have it here. Climate change, we have it here. But until now, we suffer flooding, we suffer extreme weather, and the government isn't doing anything about it. When you ask them, we have funds for it, but what are you doing with those funds? We have a pandemic. We have a pandemic right now, and one of the hot button issues here right now is one small company profited from the profited from the how do we call this the procurement of personal protective equipment amounting to billions of pesos. That's around what, half a mil, 500 million dollars, if I'm not mistaken. And it's infuriating on our part because you see relatives, you see friends being taken to hospitals. The hospitals are full, doctors and nurses getting sick, for example, because they don't have these protective personal equipment. And then at the same time, you see these people in government, for example, um, profiting of a major pandemic. How is it, when you look at it, it's really a form of oppression because it tends to hinder you from addressing a problem and letting people move on with their lives. Like, for example, my day job is teaching college. Until now, we don't do face to face classes. Again, it's bungled by government incompetence and corruption. We don't know what's happening with the funds. They claim they have funds, of course, but we don't know what is happening. So, people tend to get left behind. And the one oppressive thing about corruption is that the effects are long term. It is not apparent in a few months, a few years, but when you look at it from a generational perspective, it becomes apparent. It really becomes apparent.
Thank you.
Question from Andrew.
Yeah, hi. I think this is an important topic, this issue of corruption. So what do you think in terms of a solution? I can imagine two possibilities. One is the rule of law, right? A tax system that with accountability and oversight, transparency, sunlight, like let's open the books and see what's going on. Another approach might be just a different system that is off the grid, right? So I don't know, like alternative economies, cryptocurrency, like something that is autonomous, that's separate from the system. So in a sense, it's immune from corruption because it's autonomous. Or I mean, you may have other ideas. What do you propose? What do you think is a solution to all of this?
In our case here in the Philippines, we have always been pushing for structural changes because speaking also personally as a structuralist somehow, I believe that if you strengthen institutions, for example, especially when you, like the examples you gave, courts, for example, we have the notion of an ombudsman, for example, and protect them from political pressure. I think all these things would follow. But the problem is, uh, our constitutional framework is one of the most rigid ones, I think, in at least here in Southeast Asia. Like, if you want to amend the constitution and strengthen institutions, it's always a game of numbers. Does it have the support of the public? Does it have the support of Congress, for example? And there's also this notion of cynicism when it comes to constitutional change here in the Philippines, because the last time that we changed a constitution through legal means was when Marcos tried to establish himself as a dictator in the 70s. So there's this lingering doubt on constitutional changes. So it would be a mixture of strengthening institutions and then changing also the system, because we have been independent from the United States since 1946, but we haven't thrown out the very outdated notion, at least here in the Philippines, of the presidential system. The presidential system here in the Philippines doesn't work because of the diversity of culture and the political parties. When you look at the constitutional framework of the Philippines, somehow the parts don't match. Because, for example, there in the United States, you have a presidential system, there are two dominant parties. But here you have a presidential system, you have a multi-party system, and you don't need a majority in order to win a presidency. You only need a plurality. And a plurality is one vote more than your opponent. Like, let's say 18,000 votes, your opponent got 17,999 votes. Automatic, you are the president, and that's regardless of how many people have voted. So I do agree that there should be institutional changes, but again, when we talk about institutional changes, it would somehow bring about a change of culture, and a change of culture would take 1 or 2 generations. I might be I won't be a young person by that time, but I do hope that that change would come at least within the next year, because again, it's a crucial election and we have to rebuild an economy, a very weakened judiciary, for example. So I think that answers your question.
I don't see any other hands. I'll ask a quick question. I think sort of piggybacking off what Andrew said, but what do you see as the best ways for influencing, say, cultural taste in the Philippines? I mean, nothing nefarious, right? But like elite opinion, um, maybe, festivals, flea market festivals, something like that. What are your thoughts?
Um, the thing about development here in the Philippines is that most of our elite, at least government officials, tend to get their ideas, again, from Western societies, try to apply it to a very deformed society such as ours, and then they will insist on doing it, even if it doesn't work. And there's this model here in the Philippines that is suited better. And I call it the grassroots model. It has been done in provincial cities such as Iloilo, which is in the Visayas, Naga City in Bicol, which is in southern Luzon, a few hundred kilometers south of Manila. And what's the grassroots model? If you are when you participate in an economy, for example, or in local government, the local government is obliged to listen to you and to give you an audience for your ideas. What's an example of this? If you are, let's say, a member of the youth sector, and there's a proposed legislation that will affect your sector, you are not just invited to that, you are required to give your opinion on that. So that's the grassroots model, as we call it. But the problem is that the grassroots model, when you apply it to other localities, it's being hijacked by what we call as political dynasties. I think 60 to 70% of our local governments are captured by political dynasties. So they would say na, we're represented here, but turns out it's a member of their family. So again, there are so many, it's actually like a Gorgon's knot when you look at it. There are so many problems to it. In terms of sidewalk vending, for example, it's mostly an embracing of the culture for me. Why do I say it's embracing of the culture? When you tell someone, especially a seasoned driver in Manila, I want to go to Quiapo, he will give you a stare. Why? Because he knows he won't pass the streets. He cannot pass through those streets because it's a commercial area. Again, the local government insists on making it an open space in which vehicles can pass through, but it won't. It really won't. So it's more of embracing the culture and and being mindful of the heritage that we have. Oh, we have a
Sorry.
question here.
No, I I accidentally was pressing buttons. That's all the time we have. I want to thank John Patrick Pineda for his wonderful presentation. So if you could all give him a hand.
Thank you so much.
And just so he has plenty of time, I want to quickly turn the floor now to Andrew Fiala, who is going to be presenting his paper, Nonviolence and Tyranny from Plato to Trump. So please give Andrew your full attention.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm on West Coast California time. It's 7:30 here. So forgive me if my voice is a little scratchy. I'm just getting started. So I have a paper that I'm going to read. I've kind of excised a bit. Hopefully it'll leave plenty of time for discussion. And just to summarize, I'm going to make 2 points. One is that that tyranny is a kind of violence. And then second, the antidote to tyranny is nonviolence. And then that's connected to my effort to look in the philosophers of peace and the philosophy of nonviolence and discover a critique of tyranny there. And that's actually been kind of overlooked, I think. It seems obvious, but people are not, the philosophers of nonviolence haven't really emphasized this. So I'm trying to just kind of bring that to the front. So, and this is based on a book that I have that's going to come out in next year that's with the title Tyranny from Plato to Trump. So it's a historical bit with Trump at the end as the end piece. So tyranny is violence and violence is tyrannical. This seems obvious, but the implication is that nonviolence is the opposite of tyranny. When we understand this, I think this helps us better understand nonviolence, and it actually helps us also understand the vision of positive peace that is associated with pacifism and nonviolence. That vision is of a world in which social and political relations are non-tyrannical. It's a world in which leaders care for the well-being of those they lead, and in which leadership is based upon consensus rather than command. It's a world in which fathers love their children, in which human beings behave with compassion towards each other and toward the non-human world. The vision of nonviolence is of a world in which there are no tyrants, lords, or masters who employ violence in order to dominate and degrade those they seek to command. So in that book that I have, the book Tyranny from Plato to Trump, I have an analysis of tyranny, and there's actually really difficult confusion because often the term is politicized. The person you don't like sometimes is just a tyrant. So we need an objective definition of tyranny. So I've come up with 3 basic criteria for understanding what a tyrant is. A tyrant is a person, 1, who desires absolute power that's exorbitant and unconstrained by the rule of law. 2, a tyrant actually has that kind of power. And 3rd, that desire for power is not based upon benevolence, justice, or anything morally appropriate. Rather, it's based on pride, ambition, self-interest, and so on. That definition, by the way, so in the book, I make this argument, that definition rules out Trump. Trump is a would-be tyrant, but he didn't actually have the kind of power that tyrants desire because of institutional constraints. And the loss of the election last year shows us this, that he actually was unable to consolidate power. Trump, I would argue, is a would-be tyrant who is motivated by ambition, pride, desire for power, narcissism, and all of that stuff. But it's the lack of actual power that makes the important difference there. And I think the good news story about Trump is that our Constitution prevented him from consolidating power. So one of the solutions to tyranny is a constitutional system that prevents would-be tyrants from actualizing their desire for tyranny. So now what I want to do here is add a 4th element, which is tyranny. Then this 4th element to bring in, tyranny is a view of power that's connected with violence and a license for violence. Furthermore, I think tyrants may actually be the sorts of persons who enjoy violence. There's a lot more we'd have to pull apart there in terms of the difference between a license to use violence versus enjoyment of violence. Set that aside. So a bit of a historical argument here now. So in the Greek tradition, as you know, I'm summarizing a whole bunch of stuff. But as you know, the word hubris shows up in connection with tyranny. We see this in Sophocles. And the word hubris, we sometimes translate it as pride, but actually when you dig into the texts and you look at the etymologies and so on, the word hubris, one Greek definition, Greek dictionary definition defines hubris as wanton violence arising from pride or strength or passion, violence being the key idea there. In the play Oedipus the Tyrant, Oedipus Rex, there's a famous and important claim which says that hubris gives birth to tyranny. But I think we could also translate that as violence gives birth to tyranny. And in fact, when you look at these texts, some people argue that it could be read the other way around. So it's not only that hubris gives birth to tyranny, but tyranny gives birth to hubris. And if we substitute violence for hubris, we might say violence begets tyranny and tyranny begets violence. Plato deals with this in a number of texts. We see discussions of this in Republic. Little known and little read texts like Theages and Alcibiades. Some claim these are spurious texts, but anyway, they're in the Platonic corpus. The discussion of violence and hubris and tyranny flows throughout Plato's works. One interesting component here is that in the Platonic texts, Plato suggests that the tyrant wants to have godlike power. And the idea of having godlike power is understood as the ability to do violence with impunity, to get away with doing violence. And you see that the most famous example often taught in philosophy, Intro to Philosophy, the Ring of Gyges story, which is a story about violence with impunity. There are other texts that talk about this, and including theological speculations about Zeus as a tyrant, and Zeus has the ability to do violence both to the other gods and to humans and so on. Okay, so moving on, one question in all of this is whether any of that can be justified. So it's important to put on the table that the Greeks were not pacifists. They didn't have a complex theory of nonviolence, although there are some hints in Plato about a philosophy of nonviolence. One of the issues in Plato and Aristotle is the question of the justification of violence. So let's move on then to think about philosopher kings, right? The famous Plato idea of the philosopher king. The philosopher king does employ some violence, right? So the transition to the Callipolis, to the perfect city, the transition includes a kind of violence. The older generation is banished. Sexual norms are disrupted through coercion. Children are taken away from their parents. There's a noble lie employed. All of this is a kind of violence. But Plato suggests it would be justified in the name of bringing about the perfect city. This, of course, as many of you may know, this leads to criticisms by folks like Karl Popper in the 20th century. Popper suggested that Plato was a kind of proto-totalitarian for some of this stuff. Well, it turns out when you really start digging in and thinking about the justification of violence, Plato's discussion of tyranny, it becomes interesting, to say the least, because in certain places, Plato articulates a view that's critical of violence, even the violence of the philosopher king. The famous seventh letter, again, it may or may not be Plato's own hand that writes this letter, but nonetheless, it's there in the tradition. In the seventh letter, he says, I'm going to read this, he says, the philosophical reformer ought not to apply violence to his fatherland in the form of a political revolution, whenever it is impossible to establish the best kind of polity without banishing and slaughtering citizens, but rather he ought to keep quiet and pray for what is good, both for himself and his state. So there's a claim that Plato's making here is that even though in Republic he's imagining violence in the transition, violence is not the preferred methodology. And I would argue, if we had more time, that part of the issue is that violence and tyranny go hand in hand. How do you prevent the philosopher king from becoming just a tyrant? The issue there has to do with violence. Now, I already mentioned that this claim about tyranny can be politicized. You see this in the Greek texts also, and you may know that Plato sucked up to tyrants. In Syracuse, Aristotle flirted with tyrants. At one point in Aristotle's life, he flees Athens and he goes and hangs out with a tyrant in Asia Minor. Alexander the Great is a tyrant who Aristotle's associated with. One issue in all of this is a terminological, subjective, politicized notion of tyranny. And it turns out, when you look at the history of thinking about tyranny, Hobbes makes this kind of comment. One person's savior is another person's tyrant, right? The terminology itself is heavily politicized. You may know that Abraham Lincoln was accused of being a tyrant. When John Wilkes Booth assassinates Lincoln, he yells out, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, quoting Shakespeare's Julius Caesar and so on. The Southern newspapers praised John Wilkes Booth, saying he slew a tyrant. Right on John Wilkes Booth. Notice again, the problem is this is heavily politicized. In the book, I do a little bit more with this. Trump has been accused of being a tyrant. Obama was accused of being a tyrant. Biden has recently been accused of being a tyrant. In one sense, a tyrant is simply someone we don't like. Now that's inadequate, right? Philosophers are not going to be happy with this. So back to my criteria, right? I said a tyrant aspires to have power, actually has that power, and that aspiration for power is motivated by immoral or unjust motivations. I think we also need to add in that tyrants use power in unjustified ways, right? So if we bring violence in the table here, we're gonna have to talk about the justification or not of violence. So there's a whole discourse on this, right? Later sessions in this conference, we'll be talking about just war and big questions about the justification of violence. I think the contribution that the pacifist and nonviolence tradition, the philosophy of nonviolence, brings to this is that deep and sustained critique of the idea of justified violence. So let me switch over then to the second part of the discussion, which is about that critique that's found in the philosophers of nonviolence, the nonviolent tradition, pacifism, and so on. As I mentioned, there are hints here and there. As far as I can tell, I haven't seen a sustained discussion of this, of the connection between anti-tyranny and nonviolence, but there are hints. Thomas Merton, for example, in one place says, if you love peace, then hate tyranny. If you love peace, then you should hate tyranny. James Lawson, who you may know is the person that sort of led the strategies in the civil rights movement. He had been in India. He worked with King on the nonviolent civil rights movement in the 60s. Lawson gave a recent talk. We published this in a book that I'm the editor of, where he discusses Trump, and he says that Trump is the personification of tyranny. And Lawson's suggestion is that the way to fight against tyranny is through nonviolence. In other words, nonviolence is the opposite of tyranny, as Lawson describes it. I dug into some of the texts and philosophies and tried to pull out key passages. I got a bunch of them. I'm not going to read them to you, but just give you one important component here, which is that Gandhi repeatedly comes back to a critique of tyranny, which was actually surprising to me. I'd never heard that. I never really thought of Gandhi as a critic of tyranny. And it shows up in a number of ways. So in a passage in 1915, Gandhi says, by all means, resist tyranny wherever you find it. By all means, resist encroachment upon your liberty, but not by shedding the blood of the tyrant. So notice what this passage shows us is that Gandhian nonviolent resistance is basically a call for resistance to tyranny. Back to what I said earlier, my proposal is that nonviolence is the opposite of tyranny. The way to fight back against tyranny is nonviolently. In the vow of nonviolence of Gandhi's ashram in 1915, around that same time, there's a discussion of tyranny in the vow of nonviolence in the ashram. He says, in addition to a bunch of other stuff, a member of the ashram who takes this vow of nonviolence would oppose, this is a quote now, would oppose the tyranny wherever they find it, parents, governments, or others. But the nonviolent opponent of tyranny will never hurt or kill the tyrant. He continues, the follower of truth and nonviolence will offer satyagraha, against tyranny and win over the tyrant by love. He will not carry out the tyrant's will, but he will suffer punishment even unto death for disobeying his will until the tyrant himself is won over. Interesting, you could imagine a conversation between Gandhi and John Wilkes Booth, right, the assassin. And you could imagine all sorts of other things coming out of this. Gandhi basically is articulating the idea of nonviolent resistance to tyranny. He expands this in a couple of other places. One really interesting passage takes this towards nonviolence towards animals, which Gandhi connects to tyranny. So in a discussion of vivisection from 1921, Gandhi says that human beings should not be tyrants over animals, basically, and that vivisection and animal cruelty is a kind of tyranny over animals, and so on and so forth. So there's some other connections we could make just to put these on the table, maybe for further discussion. Within the family, a father ought not be a tyrant over his children, over the members of his family. Within businesses, business leaders ought not behave tyrannical. Within academic faculty meetings, and so on. Okay, so let's connect this then to a discussion of truth and love, important concepts in the philosophy of nonviolence, and especially with Gandhi, as you know, satyagraha is truth force, love force, and so on. What does that mean? Truth force, love force, satyagraha, it's non-tyrannical, it's anti-tyrannical. Nonviolent love, nonviolent truth is anti-tyrannical truth, anti-tyrannical love. There's a couple other passages where Gandhi plays that out and explains this. And I think this is interesting because it connects us to ideas we see in Plato. You may remember, I mean, philosophy is love of wisdom, right? Plato writes a symposium, a bunch of other texts where love is an important concept. In Plato's discussion of tyranny, it's usually the case that tyranny is the result of a corrupted form of love. The tyrant loves power, the tyrant loves violence in some cases, and the tyrant loves himself. This is the narcissism that comes back in. This is the root of tyranny in Plato. And I think we can trace a line. I'm not saying that Gandhi read Plato on this, but the concept, the idea flows through to Gandhi's notions of love for truth, love for nonviolence. We see that even in Plato, I believe. How am I doing on time here? I think I've got maybe 3 or 4 more minutes before we get to discussion. David, is that okay? So what in my analysis of tyranny in the book, much larger thing, there are 3 characters that I discuss: the tyrant, him or herself, the sycophants, who basically facilitate tyranny, and then the moronic masses. And I use the word moron there, it's a Greek term. Plato uses this term moron. This is the uneducated, unvirtuous masses. We could trace this critique of tyranny out in each of those 3 characters. As I said one more time, the tyrant seems to love violence and love himself. The sycophants, the suck-ups, love power, right? Although they're not willing to grab power like the tyrant does. But what the sycophant does is provide a facade of justification for violence, for the tyrant's violence. You know, in the contemporary world, these are the media spin doctors and the legislators who apologize and cover up for tyrannical things and so on. And then really most interesting are the masses, the mob, the morons, to use that technical term, the mob who loves violence in the sense that violence is entertaining and exciting. I think there's a malfunction at all 3 levels. So in the book, I had proposed 2 solutions for this big problem, the problem of tyrants, sycophants, and the moronic masses. One solution, I started with this, is the rule of law. Constitutional brakes on power. This is why Trump is actually not a tyrant. The Constitution works to prevent the sycophants from continuing to cover up and support Trump. The Constitution and the rule of law also prevented the masses from subverting the government on January 6th and so on. The second solution I discuss is moral education. So we see that clearly in Plato, that this is Plato's idea. So let me now propose a conclusion. The third solution, and I didn't write this in the book, so this is the contribution of the paper. The third solution is the critique of violence and a philosophy of nonviolence, because that is anti-tyrannical, non-tyrannical. So I think one thing just to throw on the table and then maybe go over for discussion is to connect this back to a notion of positive peace as opposed to negative peace. The constitutional framework provides negative peace. It prevents the tyrant from grabbing power. It doesn't cure the tyrant's soul. It just prevents the would-be tyrant from becoming a tyrant. That's a negative peace idea. The tradition of nonviolence, pacifism, the philosophy of nonviolence actually has a stronger vision than that. It's a vision of positive peace. And the vision of positive peace is an anti-tyrannical, a non-tyrannical vision. In positive peace, there is genuine leadership that's based on care rather than command. In positive peace, there are positive virtues and values such as respect for truth, compassion, wisdom, those sort of positive upbuilding virtues. And that we don't see that, by the way, in the liberal tradition, right? Where folks are talking about the negative peace of constitutional breaks on tyranny. We don't see the vision of positive peace articulated, which is why I actually think the philosophy of nonviolence, pacifism can bring something new to the conversation of tyranny that's in addition to the liberal tradition that talks about constitutional break. And the thing that's new there is a deep and sustained notion of the non-tyrannical, the anti-tyrannical. And then I mentioned previously, this vision extends to ideas about what we see in the family, non-tyrannical parenting, for example, relations to non-human animals. Gandhi mentioned that, right? A non-tyrannical relation to the non-human world. And all of that, I think, is wrapped up in a philosophy of positive peace. Final sentence, just to read from my conclusion here. We need to understand that the political project of ending tyranny is connected to the problem of tyranny and violence in all of social life, in families, businesses, in our treatment of the non-human, and so on. And to reiterate a point made by Gandhi, the struggle against tyranny must be nonviolent, which means that the struggle against tyranny cannot itself become tyrannical. Thank you.
All right, I see no questions in the chat, so I'm going to open questioning up to anyone who would like to raise their hand. Leonard.
Thanks. And Andrew, thanks for your talk. I've got a question about how you deal with some of the borderline cases around the three conditions of tyranny that you mentioned early in your talk. These are cases where I think intuitively we'd say this person is a tyrant, but the person doesn't quite meet the condition. So just interested in your reactions. First one, the person desires absolute power. Well, you can imagine a tyrant who says, yes, I desire absolute power except over mother. Mother can do anything she wants. The person is still a tyrant. Intuitively, but doesn't quite meet the condition because the desire isn't complete. It's possible to start playing around with cases like that. So too, with the second condition, the person has absolute power. Absolute power is a lot of power. And it may be that somebody has control over just about anything you like, except some police department in a podunk town somewhere. Again, still intuitively a tyrant. Final point, this is about the motivations. You suggest, pride, ambition, that kind of thing have to be the motivating forces. Fair enough. Although somebody might have sort of decidedly mixed motivation. The person might be motivated by those things, but might also be motivated by a desire for benevolence, confused as it might be, right? It may be well-intentioned, but horrific. So just interested in what you make of those kind of borderline cases.
Yeah, no, thanks, Leonard. These are interesting questions. I think what you're suggesting is that that like full-blown absolute tyranny is this kind of Platonic ideal, right? It's a limit case, and nobody quite gets there, right? So probably the world we live in is a bunch of mixed and limited cases, right? Where people, as you said, people have mixed motivations. They love other things other than themselves, right? I mean, no one is just purely narcissistic. I think you're exactly right about that. A hint about this, I think, is found in Plato. So my two thoughts come to mind. One is when Plato there's two places where he talks about this. One is the dialogue Theages, and the other is the dialogue Alcibiades. And in both cases, there's a kind of theological moment where the Theages, the young man who desires to be a tyrant, Socrates says, oh, I get it. What you really desire is to be God. Right? The dream of pure absolute tyranny is actually the desire to be God, where you can get away with literally everything, right? And Theages very quickly says, well, yeah, except not, right? There's other things, right? So it could be that the dream of tyranny is this nth degree of tyranny, narcissism, and so on. Probably right. So in the real world, it's much more limited than that, and there's going to be mixed motives and so on. I think that helps us imagine part of the solution, which is in the real world, there are constraints on even the most tyrannical person's behavior. Part of the constraints are constitutional, right? That the structures just don't permit anyone to become a god. Just doesn't work that way. As you said, the podunk police department, the sheriff says, I'm not going along, right? So there's a separation of powers and the complexity of the way that power structures operate. Also, I think no personality is fixed. So I'm not a Platonist. I'm actually more of like an American pragmatist. My real sympathies lie with the fact that we're in flux and we're in the middle of a world that's complicated and has all kinds of pluralistic issues and concerns, and the human psyche is not permanently fixed. One problem you could argue against Plato also is that he kind of projects these pure character types, right? As if the tyrant that he describes in Republic, in the second half of the Republic, as if the tyrant is, I don't know, like a character lifted out of history, right? Like Theages, who desires to be a god. In the real world, that's just not the way it works, right? There's stories about education and influence, and people change. I think people actually can change. If you believe in education, probably there's a hope that people can change. So I thank you. It's a great question. I'm not sure. I'm trying to think how to connect that to the discussions in Gandhi and other places. Just the thought about that, and I'll shut up. Is that Gandhi's vision of the power of nonviolence is that we can actually change people's minds also. That even I think I see this in Gandhi, that there's a hope that even the most tyrannical British overlord could change their mind and be persuaded. So I think the vision of nonviolence and pacifism is this hopeful idea that no one really is a full-blown absolute tyrant. There's chinks in that armor, right? And we can leverage those in different ways.
Two very quick follow-ups, if nobody has a hand up. Yeah, so the first one, you say the human psyche is not permanently fixed. In fact, I think it's permanently broken. I agree with you there. I'll just say that what you've just said opens up some interesting conceptual space for talking about things like quasi-tyrants or pseudo-tyrants, all right? So there might be some nice room for conceptual exploration.
Yeah, one reason to make to put this on the table is the politicized language around Trump actually bothered me, right? When you see these like bumper sticker, Trump is a tyrant kind of, like it's more subtle and more complicated and more interesting than that, right? And we tend to, even back to like the Abraham Lincoln case, right? When we start dealing in these Platonic ideals, for want of a better word, next thing you know, violence enters in, because if someone really is a tyrant, then the only solution is to kill them. And we see this in the Greeks, the tyrannicide in Roman history, right? And I think John Wilkes Booth murdering Abraham Lincoln is part of the problem. And it goes both ways, right? So a kind of liberal anti-Trump that says, well, the next phase, the only thing we can do is kill the tyrant. Let's think differently about these things.
Sanjay had a comment over in the chat. Andy, I don't know if you can see that or not.
Yeah.
If Sanjay wants to
sorry about
unmute and read it, that's fine too.
Well, I think what Sanjay's suggesting is that there's the question of, does it work? Does nonviolence and satyagraha, does it work against tyrants? I think Gandhi clearly thinks it does. And when you look at those passages where he talks about tyranny, he stipulates, like it's a normative first principle, that the only way to fight back against tyranny is with non-tyrannical or non-violent means. Does it work? And why might it work? I think, Sanjay, I'm not sure if that's exactly where you're going with this. But back to what I said earlier with regard to Leonard, is that part of this has to be the hope that even the tyrant can be reached somehow through political nonviolence, through education, through an appeal to love, through platonic dialogue, right? That somehow there must be some way that the tyrant can be reached nonviolently, either with people in the streets or with education, and so on. And I think where Gandhi's not willing to go is to that John Wilkes Booth moment, where the tyrant is irredeemable, and now the only choice is to use violence against him. I think that's the philosophy of nonviolence is continually trying to imagine those nonviolent alternatives.
Everyone hear me?
Yep.
Hello?
Hi, Sanjay, I can hear you.
Yeah, can anyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Andy. I'm sort of away right now. I can't really get good connection, but basically my question is, how committed would you say one who accepts a philosophy of nonviolence should be to that kind of Gandhian view that nonviolence would work even against the most brutal of tyrants? Do you see that as being something that's sort of required for one to really adopt a philosophy of nonviolence?
Yeah, Sanjay, I understand your question. I mean, there's so many things that we could dig into here in terms of the effectiveness of nonviolence and so on. You're making me think of something, if you don't mind me just shifting gears just for a second. The American revolutionaries were anti-tyrants, right? The Declaration of Independence includes the language of tyranny. The American Revolution is based on an anti-tyrannical approach, including also then the creation of the constitutional system, right? The critique of tyranny is implicit in all of that. What I'm suggesting is that maybe what we need to do is bring the founding fathers into conversation with Gandhi and the philosophers of nonviolence and see what we might come up with there. Now, I mean, and it turns out in the real world, everything's complicated and difficult. As I was saying in conversation with Leonard, like it's hard to be an absolutist about all of this, but the two divergent approaches, I would argue, are the approach we see in the American revolutionaries and then the Gandhian approach. And something happens between 1776 and the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, right? There's a shift in terms of thinking about strategies. And I think it's also interesting that in both cases, it's an argument against the British imperial rule. Somehow, I think we need to keep our eye on both of those. Although, again, as I suggest, because I'm very interested in the strategies of nonviolence and the Gandhian message, we need to think about how and whether Gandhian strategies could be as effective as those American revolutionary strategies. And in fact, that's what you see in the liberation movement of India. It's a different way of fighting back against the British tyrant in a way. Maybe, there's a whole bunch of issues here about technology and political development and the view from the margins and et cetera, et cetera. But I think that's important framework to think about, both the American revolutionaries as anti-tyrants and Gandhi as an anti-tyrant.
I think we are out of time. I want to first of all thank Andrew Fiala for his wonderful presentation. I also want to apologize to the people in chat when I missed your questions. I just didn't see them. So sorry. You can, of course, contact Andrew about your questions afterwards if you'd like. I think we have a 10-minute break. And then
Yeah,
we're
we
going
have
to
a
return.
10-minute break. Thank you, Dave, for chairing, and John Patrick and Andy for discussing. I'm happy to leave the Zoom room open for a few minutes if you want to address the other two questions that were asked, Andy. I will have to stop in a couple of minutes just to